in which case you're then either forced to form a coalition with the ANC, which is going to be painful for you down the line, trust me, or you're kind of leaving the ANC to a potential EFF coalition, right? Which could also be disastrous for South Africa. So yeah, like I think any situation where the ANC reaches 45 and the opposition, and particularly the market-driven opposition, hasn't caused it, hasn't grown, and doesn't get closer to 45 itself, opens up a huge risk of an ANC-EFF coalition.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our world view. Today we have back with us Dawie Scholtz. Dawie is, of course, Action SA spokesperson. Dawie, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Donald. Good to be on.
Well, Dawie, that was a joke, but what is your official position now currently, just for our listeners, viewers?
So I'm obviously working in the private sector full-time. And for the record, I actually worked for the DA for about 4 years between 2010 and 2014. And have since then worked in the private sector and purely tweet in my personal capacity with my personal views, which some people seem to take seriously and others don't, since they're good, they're good, right? And then the one thing that I should disclose, I think, which is obvious, right, is that maybe for the last 3 elections, I have worked for News 24 sort of for kind of a week on a freelance basis. Like the week of the election, I do election analysis for them. So I've built a quantitative election model to do election projections, and then I do kind of work for them in an exclusive way for a week or so around the election. But I'm not employed by them. I don't have a long-term formal arrangement with them, or obviously not with any political party at this point.
Dawie, that joke originated from Leon Schreiber. Do you know him? Because I think you probably saw his tweets, and he was just a year older than I was to initiate me and Paul Ruiz. So do you know Leon Schreiber?
I don't know Leon, no. I've interacted with Leon on Twitter, but I actually don't know Leon at all.
Okay.
Never met him. So
Dawie, there was recently two polls released, both in Rapport and an Ipsos polling. What do you make of these two polls? I think you mentioned they are almost obsolete in terms of their significance, but okay, perhaps it's best that you explain them to our viewers.
Yeah, look, obviously all data points, gossiped or not, are interesting, right? So I understand why the media covers it, and it's all very interesting. But kind of from a credible, detailed elections analysis perspective, I don't think either of those two polls have any value. The Ipsos one, I think, is most obviously not of value, just because of the kind of the way that they've done the poll and kind of tallied up the data, right? So I think if you add up all of the political parties and their support in the Ipsos poll, it gets something like 65% or 70% or something. So like 30% of the people are not in the poll. There's no like support associated with 30% of the people on the poll. Why is that? Because a huge portion of the people are either not registered to vote, expressed an interest not to vote, or then didn't say who they would vote for, or were still uncertain, right? And if you want to do polling well, what you need to do is you need to exclude the people who are not registered, and you need to exclude the people who have expressly stated they will not vote, because they don't matter, right? So, and of course, for the undecided, if you want to do polling very well, you preferably need to allocate them with the kind of proper model that you build to kind of predict who you think they will vote for, even though they don't tell you who they want to vote for, based on past support, based on demographics, based on maybe their responses to some other questions in the poll. And the problem with the Ipsos poll is that it only goes up to 70%, and it hasn't done that for 30% of the voters. So I think the finding was that the ANC got 42% of the vote in that poll, but the problem is it's 42 out of 70. Which is why 42 doesn't really make any sense, because how much of the kind of rest of the 30 is going to the ANC? And the exact same kind of argument could be made for the DA percentage in the poll. I think the poll's the DA at 11%, which is an absurdly low number. I don't think anybody credibly believes the DA is at 11%, because it's 11 in this poll out of 70, and the question is where the other 30 will go. So, which is why I just don't think it's not a particularly useful poll, and doesn't really tell us much about party political support. For that reason. And then the second one, the report is, look, the numbers are wildly optimistic for opposition parties and pessimistic for the ANC, right? It's not totally out of rational bounds. However, from a kind of credible analytical perspective, there actually is no report poll, because, there is no source. I think the article said a credible source, and it's 2 weeks later and no one has said who did the poll, who paid for it, who executed it, where was it done, is it urban, is it rural, is it everywhere, is it online, is it on phone, what's the sample size, etc., etc. So look, we don't know anything about that poll, right? I'm sure at some point it will surface. I would love to discuss it in detail once the numbers come out, or the sourcing and methodology comes out properly. But so for me, the report poll is, I can also do a poll of my neighbors. It doesn't mean it's credible. So we don't know anything about the report poll.
Dawie, it might be interesting. I don't know. You can you've worked for the DA, like you've said, but do you think there's a possibility that they released or they leaked this internal poll because they know the Ipsos poll would come out shortly, and Ipsos polls in general are not favorable towards the DA? So they leaked this poll to get some credible news coverage in conjunction with the Ipsos poll, which would come out soon.
That's very possible. Look, I mean, you can speculate about 50 different things about what's going on here. I don't know. Yes, that's one of my pet theories, is exactly that. But again, we can gossip about it, but I have no factual basis to know whether it's their polling or not. To be honest, I would be slightly doubtful that it's DA internal polling, or at least a fully honest view of internal DA polling, just because the numbers are so wildly out of, I think, the rational range, right? 38% for the ANC would just imply something completely extraordinary. And look, I mean, maybe the hugest swing ever has happened in the last 6 months that we don't know about, but that kind of hasn't showed up anywhere else. But DA internal polling, in my experience, is actually excellent. They probably have the best internal polling, or the best polling capability in South Africa. And so I would be surprised if that is their internal polling, to be perfectly honest. To me, it seems like a kind of outlier poll, most likely, but again, we're just speculating, right? I would love to see the source, the methodology, etc.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I said it is the consistency in which everyone noteworthy from the D8 retweeted that report poll. It's sort of like there was a directive. Okay, the moment this comes out, you have to tweet it. I mean, Leon Schreiber, Leon Zille, everyone of note quickly retweeted that. Perhaps I'm being a bit paranoid, but the quickness in the response, yeah.
Look, my view is that political parties will always amplify news that is good for them, right? So I think it was totally rational for them to do that. It's a poll that looked good for the DA. So if I was still working for the DA and still the DA's comms operation, I would have done exactly the same thing. So I think it's totally rational, and I'm not too surprised by that. I don't think that necessarily means that it was planned or coordinated, if you ask me.
Dawie, what do you think of clearly Action SA's and the Democratic Alliance's war at the moment? What do you think of the significance? Why are they fighting each other almost on a daily basis? Yeah,
look, I think this is a nuanced discussion. I think there's many points to be had, right? So the one point is, what is the genesis? Why is this taking place? I think, and then I guess the second point is, what does it mean for the future, right? Particularly for 2024. So why it's taking place? Look, my view is absolutely that these are two parties that certainly for the DA, Action SA is going after a number of the voters that have historically voted for it. Like, there's no doubt about it. In Gauteng, in last year's election, and even in KZN, there are some DA voters who switched over to Action SA, and it was actually a significant number in Johannesburg. There's been one by-election since last year where both contested and competed in kind of the suburban electorate. That was that election in, I can't remember the ward number, but in Tshwane, in a kind of quite conservative Afrikaans community. The DA lost some support, but not a lot. Action SA gained quite a lot of support in the by-election. So there's clearly contestation and a risk for the DA, and some of its voters could go over to Action SA. So for me, it's entirely rational that the DA would try to stop that, right? And that Action SA is trying to grow into the DA's electorate. I think Action SA's kind of target markets is, of course, not just the DA electorate. So it's kind of fighting a little bit of a multi-front war, right? It's fighting with the DA and the suburban electorate. It's fighting with the ANC and the EFF and the township and the rural electorate. But I think this part of the fight will continue. Look, many people have the view that there's sort of deep personal animosities involved, given that many of the people in Action SA are former DA people. I personally don't actually subscribe to that view. I think some of the fights get as colorful as they do, perhaps because of that reason. But actually, fundamentally, what's being driven is that two parties is competing for the same electorate, right? And the one thing I do think, which is true, is probably it's a real contestation. I don't think that Action SA's one support that it's already gained probably in that community is insignificant, and certainly its potential is not insignificant. So that's why the DA is taking it so seriously and spending so much time and energy on it, and probably eventually before 2024 money on it. There's one other element to this, which is a little bit more controversial, but happy to share the inside scoop with you, Donald, which is that I think a big part of this is about money, is about the donor community. And I think that Action SA, from what I hear, right, and also not based on facts, but kind of the backroom gossip in political circles, is that a large amount of the typical donor community that has stood with the DA for many years has gone over to Action SA in a big way.
The Oppenheimers.
Basically with the, no, I think it's more broadly, and I'm not going to mention specific names. I think a big part of the donor community has gone over to Action SA in a big way, and I think that's potentially causing real concerns for the DA. So my view is that probably there's something in the DA motivation about trying to discredit Action SA as quickly as possible to put an end to that. And look, then the final thing about what it means for the future is, I know I will get called the Action SA spokesperson again for saying this, but I read Michael Beaumont's op-ed in the Sunday Times this weekend, and I actually really do objectively agree with it, in that I think that coalition parties can and should hold each other to account, and that's just the normal way politics works. The fact that these two parties are contesting, are fighting, yes, are kind of competing for the same votes, but ultimately in coalitions together, doesn't mean that we can't have a constructive coalition outcome in 2024 if the numbers stack up in the right way for that to happen, right? Which frankly is unlikely. We can discuss that in a moment. So this idea that the two parties are at each other's throats is a disaster for any potential coalition set up in 2024 or the existing coalitions. I don't agree with that. I think the engagement is robust, yes, but my sense is that all of the parties are still committed to the coalition agreements. I mean, the one thing that everyone can get around is that they want to get the ANC out, right? So my expectation is that it will be robust, but I think still focused towards a coalition outcome in 2024 if the numbers stack up in the right way. So look, I think this idea that there can't be tough contestation is nonsensical. And I mean, maybe one more comment to say is, can you imagine if it was, the Tshwane example was classic, if it was just a majority ANC government that was, firstly, it wouldn't have been thinking about bringing in independent power producers, but let's say it was, it would have been a multi-billion rand boondoggle without any consequences, without any oversight or questions being asked. I think it's great that there are questions being asked. So, and by the way, that issue I've not studied in any detail, so I have no idea what Action SA is right or not. I really don't. But the fact that questions are being asked, I think, is constructive, and it will continue to be the case in, I suspect, these coalitions that are running now, and if there are coalitions in 2024 as well.
Yeah, I think South Africans are generally not used to this entire idea of coalitions. That's why they're reacting so aggressively. I mean, like a person
and
like
friends kind of holding each other to account, right?
Yeah,
difficult
absolutely. I think like Dr. Frans Cronje on our show has said, for 400 years, we've almost been governed by this idea of a one party. I mean, either it was the Dutch or the English or the National Party or the ANC. Now, all of a sudden, we have to have coalitions, and it's unique to South Africa. But Dawie, more cynical people would say the war between Action SA and the Democratic Alliance is potentially actually benefiting both of them, because it's creating a media landscape in which it's a choice between either of the two. It's no longer a choice between the DA and the ANC or Action SA and the ANC. It's now a choice between the DA and Action SA. The sort of that it's being framed this way, and the ANC is losing its limelight, its relevance. Do you think there's a potential argument to be made there? That's why they're fighting, because the ANC is becoming, then you're basically isolating the ANC in that sense.
Not really. To be perfectly honest, I don't buy that argument. I think you only buy that argument if you think that this contestation is framed, set up for, and relevant for ANC voters, right? I don't think it is. I don't think this discussion between the ANC and the DA is relevant, or Action SA and the DA is relevant for ANC voters. I think it's there's a separate contestation taking place for ANC voters, but for me, that's not this discussion. I think for me, this discussion is kind of purely about former DA voters and DA trying to consolidate it as much as possible, and Action SA trying to grow into it. I do think the one thing which is interesting is, because you've raised an interesting question, right? Like, who benefits from this? Because I think the DA's strategic choice clearly is like to go after these guys, right? Which is probably the right thing, because I think the threat exists whether they go after them or not. But what is really interesting to me is the extent to which the DA is willing to and actively feeding coverage of Action SA. Because this is elevating Action SA, right? Every time there's a debate which has like major Sunday newspapers covering both sides, and then there's an op-ed, and then there's another op-ed, and then there's a letter to the editor, and it just fuels coverage of Action SA, which is a much smaller, much newer party that frankly still has very low name recognition, right? Like even after last year's election, the single biggest thing that's holding back.
Just quickly on that point, a recent interview with Helen Zille did on BizNews, somehow she brought up Action SA also in that interview. It's interesting to me. Yeah, it's like you said, that with Action SA constantly is being brought up, but yeah.
It's feeding their name recognition, right? So look, I think the DA probably has made the calculation that yes, it will feed their name recognition. Yes, it will drive up the Action SA awareness amongst voters, which is one of the single biggest things holding back Action SA, is that not a lot of voters know a lot about them. But they probably also made the calculation that that kind of these guys are going to be a factor anyway, and they need to go for them, which I think is what's happening. And then of course there's my pet theory about the donors, right? I think that for me is potentially the kind of 2 or 3 reasons why they could be doing it.
Sorry, the theory about?
The donors.
The donors. Oh, yeah, okay.
The spirit actually is over potential donors, yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. And do you think there's any, for example, do you think there's a person like Herman Mashaba, he's deliberately, he's not, I mean, a lot of people say he's just emotional or angry person, but do you think there's any chance that he's deliberately attacking the DA just for news coverage? That he's not as genuine in his anger or his emotion as you might think. He's just attacking the DA because he knows that will give him the news coverage that will elevate Action SA like he wants it to be elevated.
Look, I think that's absolutely the case for all parties involved here, right? Like, I'm pretty sure both parties are making calculated efforts to try to get coverage through confrontation. I think it will be interesting to observe over time, though, about who is picking more of the fights. My sense is that kind of it started out kind of roughly equally. Then it felt to me like for a long time the DA was picking most of the fights, actually, up until the Strane thing. So now I'm a bit more uncertain about it. So we'll see. But it felt to me maybe for the last kind of 3 to 4 months or so that the DA had made a concerted choice to go after Action SA, which is probably the right thing, but risky, right? As I said, from a name recognition perspective. But yeah, we'll have to wait and see how it plays out, and it'll be very interesting to see, as I said, who initiates the fights more often.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think this competition is very healthy because I definitely don't think. I mean, the DA is human beings, and I mean they're definitely not as clean as people might think they are. Especially up in 2 years of running this platform, you realize all of these facts. Okay, but yeah, Dawie, I want to go over to your tweets, and you can perhaps correct me if I'm wrong. But recently you tweeted, "How is it possible that so many people still vote for the ANC? Because the ANC is the only party with a credible redistributive economic policy platform to create a fairer society." What did you mean with that tweet? And I studied law, and one word that's very interesting to me, and I think you made a mistake with this word. You said credible redistributive policy. Perhaps you can explain better what you meant with that tweet.
Did I include the word perceived credible? Because I think the word perceived is in there, or at least it was intended to be.
I can quickly Google.
Anyway, no, it's okay. So look, if I excluded the word, then it was definitely an omission, but it was certainly my intention to say that I think many voters perceive the ANC, and perceive is the important word for me in that sentence, to have a credible kind of redistributive economic policy platform, right? And to be the only party that has it. So let's review, right? So in the focus grouping and the polling that I've seen, a lot of people actually, and also I think when you talk about the voters that care about the redistributive economic policy platform, right, that those are poor voters, which by definition in South Africa is overwhelmingly black voters, right? Which is the market that's traditionally voted ANC, and those are the voters that basically the opposition needs to swing some portion of to have any chance of a coalition discussion in 2024, right? So if you kind of go through the research and see how they perceive the various parties, right? The EFF actually scores very high on having a redistributive economic policy platform. They're going to do lots of stuff that takes wealth and money from rich people, let's be honest, rich white people, and give it to people who have historically been dispossessed, right? That's the EFF economic policy platform. But actually, it's not considered credible. There's a lot of those voters that say, I like the sound of this, but I think if you do it, it's going to be chaos. And I don't think you guys can do it because you like to throw chairs around, you start fights in parliament. You guys can't implement something complex that actually is going to help the country. So I like the sound of what you guys are talking EFF, but it's not credible. I don't believe it can work. I don't take it seriously. So they, in my view, are not perceived by the rump of the black electorate in South Africa to have a credible redistributive economic policy platform. Okay. Which I'll go through the DA very quickly, but I think it should be very clear. The DA is perceived to not have a clear alternative to BEE, not have a clear alternative to create a more equal and fair society. I mean, we can talk about that at length, but my view is that the kind of policy proposal that the party has put on the table, which is a sort of kind of quasi BEE program, but then instead of race, you have the kind of UN Sustainable Development Goals, and then it doesn't give a detail out how at all the companies would do that. Just is not a credible proposal in any way, from my perspective. And if they wanted it to be credible, it would have to be thought out like way more. So the DA hasn't put on the table a kind of credible alternative that you can take to a voter and say, this is tangibly, practically what the DA is going to do to replace the ANC's redistributive economic policy platform. And look, a lot of these voters say something like, we perceive the ANC to be corrupt. We perceive the ANC to be ineffective, not to be able to implement well, to frankly be disastrous in many ways. But at least the ANC has a set of policies which, yes, only benefits a small portion of society, but there's some small chance that I may benefit, or I know someone who has benefited. Or actually the kind of policies have become more broad-based in recent years or whatever. So I think for many voters, there's this instinctive sense that even though the ANC is corrupt and ineffective, at least they roughly have the interests of people like me at heart, right? And the three sets of policies that roughly fall into that are BEE, affirmative action, and the preferential procurement program, and maybe land reform, right? And all of the major opposition parties have some variation on their policy platform of we will scrap BEE, affirmative action, and preferential procurement, right? So then the question is, to the black voter, what is the replacement to those three things? Because I think if you don't have a concrete, credible answer to what the replacement is to those three things, and your answer is just like we will invest in education, we will create economic growth and create jobs over the next 5 to 10 years, that creates more opportunity for people, I don't think it cuts it. Because the ANC is doing stuff that some people, and hopefully you too, will feel sometime soon. And of course, coupled with that, there's just distrust from the DA perspective of being a party that's perceived as largely white, with a white leader, with lots of white MPs in parliament, etc., etc. So that's what I meant by it, is having a credible response, an alternative to BEE, affirmative action, preferential procurement, and the land reform set of policies that the ANC has.
Yeah, well, I just searched your Twitter account. I mean, to your credit, I mean, Twitter has a limit on characters, and I can completely understand why you omitted perceive. Okay, but that's not obviously you corrected that. You said what you meant by that.
Yes.
But Dawie, the problem is I mean, the DA, okay, so you're mentioning affirmative action and BEE. Do you think the average black person cares about this? I mean, we've spoken to people like Ibrahim Rasool, the former premier of the Western Cape for the ANC. And I mean, a lot of ANC people or people connected to the ANC political analysts, they say the big thing is for the past, after apartheid has ended, it's it's electricity, it's things like that, those basic grants. Those are the things that have kept people voting for the ANC. Not really, I don't know if perhaps I'm being stupid, but affirmative action and BE doesn't really account into this. And I mean, as far as I understand, the DA does not want to end that. They don't want to end any basic grants or, I don't know, the basic provisions of electricity to townships. So those things that the ANC, the typical ANC voter is scared of losing, the DA is not going to end that. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No. By the way, I completely agree on the social grant topic. I do think that this may be one of the most salient elements of this, is the kind of the fact that grants are perceived as kind of, you know, the ANC providing those, and voters credit the ANC for it, and I think give a lot of credit to the ANC for it and support the ANC for it. So that is critical. And by the way, just sorry, random side note, this topic of the basic income grant will also be crucial for 2024. I think this is one of the reasons why the ANC is so keen on it. In any event, so I buy that. And, you know, your argument is sound. I would actually be very keen to see detailed polling on that done in the right way. But there's also an associated and perhaps even more compelling problem, which is not the detail of the policy and understanding the 25-point plan that sits under how to help people like me, but the general perception and brand association that your party wants to help people like me. And I think it, of course, makes it much easier, much more credible to convince more people that you want to help them if you actually have a credible plan that wants to help them. So in that, it drives media coverage, It drives how opinion formers think about you. It drives what happens in social media. And probably for some portion of the electorate, having a detailed policy plan does actually drive how they vote. But you're right. The single most important thing is this general perception around whether you are a party, in my view, for kind of empowerment and creating a fairer society. And I just think having a set of policies that credibly allows that to happen is going to help you to create that perception. The DA's problems on this front are not just about perception, brand-related issues, but I think content which drives that.
Yeah, but Dawie, don't you think there's a difference between what a person would perceive in a place like Sandton, or a person working for News 24, and a person working in, I'm not specifically referencing you. I know people on News 24 are very vocal against the DA, and a person in, for example, the townships. I mean, if we're honest with each other, a person in the townships, they don't have access to internet, or generally, I mean, they go for days without electricity. They don't even perhaps know what the DA stance is on everything or anything, because they don't have access to basic material. So isn't that coverage basically driven by a certain media conglomerate and not really people on the ground, perhaps in the townships? For example, I've spoken to many people in the townships, and the problem they see is not the policies of the DA, it's that the DA or the people like the Vryheidsfront+, they're not in the townships. They never go to the townships. People like the DA, the Vryheidsfront+, the DA, the ACDP, they don't bother to go into the townships to sell their message. That's what they see as the problem.
I mean, look, so firstly, I completely agree. Different strata of voters want different things, right? And react differently to different things. I mean, I would be very happy to see the research about it's a fascinating question, right? Like if you go to, I mean, maybe Soweto is too urban, right? It's too close to Joburg. But if you go to the townships around Mangaung, or the townships, pick anywhere in the country, right? And you do deep research about why those voters consistently vote ANC and not DA, right? I would love to see the research. The little bit of research that I've seen is that the perception has been embedded to an extraordinary extent that the DA is predominantly white, that the DA is kind of not wanting to implement policies to undo the effects of apartheid. The DA doesn't care for Black people. And yes, it's going to take away things like social grants, which is obviously not true and an unfair perception. And basically doesn't have a plan to help people like me, right? So that is what I've seen in the research. So for me, the critical thing is, how do you then overcome that to bring about electoral change? Because electoral change in South Africa and change in South Africa requires a significant chunk of those voters to vote for someone else. And, I've been very open and transparent about my views on politics, right? I think you opened the podcast with the joke about me being the spokesperson for Action SA. I mean, I've been very transparent in saying why I'm concerned about the DA, right? Because their brand and their ability to do what we are talking about now is, in my view, fundamentally broken because of the actions and amplified by the actions they've taken for the last 3 to 4 years. And I'm very deeply concerned about the DA's ability to ever get there, given the course that the party is on now. And given the nature or the need for urgent change in South Africa, that's why, I think lots of voters are thinking about Songezo Zibi's new party, thinking about Action SA, thinking about whatever other options there may be, because the DA is demographically stuck based on everything we've seen until now. Very open to be proven wrong by actual electoral data. Nothing in any actual election for the last 4 years has suggested to me that there's any hope for the DA to get there anytime soon.
Yeah, Dawie, I would agree.
This poll in the report was by far the best and only piece of data that even suggests that by any stretch of the imagination. Like 27% implies quite a lot of black voters. That would be truly fantastic and amazing from the DA perspective. I'd love to see the actual poll methodology.
Yeah, but Dawie, I would definitely agree with you. Even though I consider myself a libertarian, classical liberal, I don't understand why the second largest party advocates for it, but you can clearly see that most South Africans don't even understand really what it is. But aren't we perhaps a bit unfair towards the DA? For example, why can't Julius Malema and the EFF step up? Why can't Kenneth Mashu and the ACDP step up? Why can't either of these opposition parties go to the center or really do an effort to capture these voters that the DA has struggled to capture? Why is it only the DA's sole responsibility to save South Africa for some people sometimes?
Well, firstly, I think it's increasingly becoming not their sole responsibility. But secondly, I think at the center of South African politics, there's probably quite a lot of people that believe in generally market-driven economics, not uniformly, but generally market-driven economics, right? With an appropriate social safety net, right? There's actually probably a lot of people, including within the DA electorate, that believe in some form of sensible redistributive economic policies in the most unequal country in the world, right? There's probably a lot of people that believe in the rule of law, in kind of all of the basic sensible liberal democratic principles that I think a lot of certainly the DA electorate, but I actually think a lot of people outside of the DA can agree with. And the ANC has systematically failed to deliver for South Africa and deliver on many of those principles, right? And so I think a lot of those people want an alternative and want a serious party to get it done, right? And the DA has for the longest time been that thing. It's been for the longest time the alternative that's growing in that direction. And any serious tallying of political power, influence, resources, everything in South Africa suggests for a very long time we had a two-party system, basically, with a lot of small parties, yes, that get their tail, but we've basically had a DA-ANC choice in South African politics ever since, 1999 to call it 2014, right? That was 15 straight years, which is fundamentally basically like a DA, okay, it was a bit complicated at the beginning for the DA, but like a DA-ANC choice. In 2014, on the ANC side of the equation, a new choice emerged in EFF, which was basically going to ANC voters and saying, hey, do you want something more radical, which a slice of the ANC electorate is interested in? And that's now the third choice in South African politics, right, was the EFF. But now the thing is, this discussion about all of the values that I spoke about, like market-driven, law and order, kind of all of the sensible things, which I'm sure you and I both agree with, the DA can't get there electorally. It's because of the actions it's taken, it cannot get there electorally, and it's stuck. And look, again, I'm not a pollster, so I don't have quantitative evidence. I just, based on all the election results we've seen, the very strong sense it can't get there. I would be very happy to be proven wrong, but strong sense that the DA can't get there. So then obviously it's going to be held to a totally different standard than the ACDP and whoever else are the small parties in South African politics. And of course, people who are interested in those values are going to be starting to ask difficult questions about how to actually get it implemented if the DA can't get there electorally, right? So no, I don't think it's a sensible kind of thing to say, oh, why is the DA being held to this tough standard? But the ACDP is not, and the Freedom Front Plus is not. No, because those parties never intended and never kind of were in serious contention to be the serious party of the rational center, right? And for me, the larger, longer mission in South African politics, and I've stated this clearly and transparently on Twitter, has always been to bring together the rational center the rump of which actually has historically voted DA, but a significant portion, maybe almost equal in size, if not more, has voted ANC, right? So there are voters that share DA values to a large extent, not fully, but that sit in the ANC who can't go to the DA for basically various brand toxicity problems, if you ask me, is my diagnosis. And then a couple of core central political kind of content issues, policy issues, as we've discussed.
Yep, but Dawie, the point of sort of I'm making is that I agree with you that the position that DA currently has, it's very difficult to get even close to the majority of South African support. But why can't, okay, you're basically what you're saying is, if I understand you correctly, that the DA has to move towards the center. But why can't a Julius Malema move towards the center? Why can't Kenneth Mashu move towards the center if they are perceived as too right wing or too left wing? Why can't they try to get a majority of South Africans vote?
Well, I mean, because they're not centrist political parties, right?
Yeah, but
like I think
like what you said, the DA is also not at this moment.
Yeah, it had the potential ones, but yeah, I agree. The DA is not, and it's not trying, right? That I would agree with, yeah. And it, as I said, it's also not particularly trying from my perspective.
Okay, so Dawie, you've mentioned many times many Black leaders are leaving the Democratic Alliance, and obviously that's the last thing you need with the Democratic Alliance trying to gain most of those supporters with Black leaders leaving your party. Do you think the DA is the party that has the highest loss in terms of Black leaders? For example, I know, for example, the EFF has an enormous turnover rate in Parliament, for example. And yeah, I didn't attend this interview to be a defense of the DA. I don't think I've ever actually voted for the DA, but I think perhaps, but I don't think that the EFF has lost an incredible amount of political leaders within Parliament, Black leaders.
Yeah. Look, I mean, this like game that the DA likes to play about like who's lost the most leaders, TM, like I don't think it's a particularly rational and helpful game, right? So, and the reason why I say that is because I mean, I haven't heard of, I mean, who are the people that the EFF has lost, right? Like if Floyd Shivambu left or Julius left or who's that People's Bay guy? Anyway, if he left.
Ndlozi, Dr. Ndlozi.
Yes. So there's like maybe 5 to 10 or 15 recognizable EFF names.
I don't know why I knew that. But anyway, sorry.
Yes. Perhaps some of them have left. I've never heard of them, right? I'm sure the ANC has lost an absolute deluge of people in the last like 5 to 10 years. If you take the same timeline that I've criticized the DA for and you say which ANC people have left, it would be an absolute deluge of people, right? But the point is not how many people. It's not the 400 people list, etc. It is a little bit to do with the centrality of those people to your brand, and the centrality of those people to your brand, and also just the amount of coverage and name recognition that they have, right? So Lindiwe Mazibuko was the parliamentary leader for the DA for many years, and also the quality of the people, right? And she was just exceptional in my view, and that was in my view a huge loss for the DA, right? Mmusi Maimane was the leader of the party and left, okay? Herman Mashaba was the mayor of Johannesburg. Patricia de Lille was the mayor of Cape Town. The list goes on and on, right? I recognize some of the people that I've listed previously are not like the biggest name brands, but I know Makashule Ghana personally. I think he's a really, really smart guy. And I think may not be from a name recognition perspective, but actually a big loss for the party from the perspective of organizing on the ground in Gauteng. So I think trying to equivocate between like this party has lost this many people and that many people is kind of irrelevant. I agree. I also agree with Helen's argument because I think at some point she was making an argument to say that look, all parties lose people and people come and go. I think that's definitely right. And when people disagree with you or are destructive to the party, or if they are we're opportunistic or whatever, it's best that they go in politics. But the problem is, if incredibly high profile people who are on your posters, who are central to your brand DNA have left, that is a political problem, and it's contributing to the DA's kind of perceived political problems at this point in time, if you ask me.
That's interesting. So basically what you're saying, if I understand it correctly, is that it's not the number, but the quality and the leadership role these people play. So for example, in the DA, Musi Maimane was the leader of the Democratic Alliance, whereas perhaps the EFF or the ANC lost more people, but it was never like a leader like Thabo Mbeki leaving the organization.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I mean, Leon was quite annoyed at me on Twitter for not speaking out about Action SA's issues in KZN, right? And a bunch of people in KZN leaving. I'm sure that the Action SA have problems in their KZN structure. I've just, me, you, and no one else have ever heard of those people, though. So there's definitely a difference between a national leader leaving and an MP or a councillor that no one has ever heard of. Yeah,
and I mean, we all know the ANC's dirty tactics, so it might have been some. Yes. I mean, some people consider this conspiracy theories, but it's entirely possible that was some sort of infiltration. But Dawie, part 7 of your tweets, you mentioned it was a few tweets that you listed, and in part 7 of your tweet, you mentioned something very interesting. I found very interesting, where you say that the DA's plan to form a coalition, as the coalition with the ANC, as a risk of having South Africa ending up with an EFF-ANC coalition. Can you perhaps explain that to our audience?
Yes. So look, I think the track we're on now, right, implies a couple of potential scenarios for 2024. And again, best guesses, we need a lot more data. But if I look at the election from last year, if I look at the polling, if I look at the little bit of by-election data we've had, to me, it looks like there's sort of a range of potential outcomes for the ANC from the mid-40s to the low 50s even, right? So the one scenario for South Africa is that we have an ANC on 51 or 52% of the vote, and things go on as is, right? Then there's a scenario where the ANC gets 48 to 49% of the vote, probably under which circumstances they form a coalition government with, kind of some of the smaller parties, the PA or, whoever they can cajole. Then there's another scenario where the ANC decides to go it alone with like 47, 48, 49% of the vote, like in a minority government, right? But the more interesting scienarios start emerging when one imagines an ANC at, like, let's just say on the outside kind of band of my current expectations, not scientific, subject to change, 45% or 44%, right? Which is lower than I'm expecting, but let's just say that up. So now we've got an ANC of 45%. They can't get together the small parties to get them over the line, right? Which then means either an ANC DA coalition, right? Which is a distinct possibility by the sounds of things. An ANC EFF coalition, right? Theoretically, an ANC IFP or an ANC Action SA coalition, right? Those are all theoretical possibilities. Although, I mean, the Action SA has been so ridiculously, like, almost shooting themselves in the foot from a negotiation perspective, but like so completely anti, it's difficult to imagine.
Dawie, to be fair, Mashaba has said within 1,000 years. So 1,000 years.
Okay, okay, maybe in 1,000 years, yes, okay. I don't know about, I honestly don't know what IFP's view is on this, but anyway, so basically once you reach the 45% position, then all bets are off. And, you know, if your strategy is to go for a kind of situation where you're a 20% party or a 22% party trying to cobble together a coalition, then there's the chance that may fail, right? In which case and I'm speaking from the DA's perspective, in which case you're then either forced to form a coalition with the ANC, which is going to be painful for you down the line, trust me, or you're kind of leaving the ANC to a potential EFF coalition, right? Which could also be disastrous for South Africa. So yeah, like I think any situation where the ANC reaches 45 and the opposition, and particularly the market-driven opposition, hasn't caused it, hasn't grown, and doesn't get closer to 45 itself, opens up a huge risk of an ANC-EFF coalition, right? Because if, and you start doing the math, right? So if it really is, let's say this poll is right, this report poll is exactly right on the number, right? What were the numbers? It was 27 DA, 6 Action SA, that got you to 33, 6 for the IFP, 39. Probably between the ACDP, the Freedom Front Plus, and a couple of other rational opposition parties, it gets you to like 44, 45. That's still not 50. So, by the way, even in the most like optimistic view that I've seen ever, the opposition also doesn't get to 50 without the EFF, by the way. So probably even in that opposition scenario, there's a real discussion to be had about whether the opposition would be open to a soft power arrangement like they have in Johannesburg now with the EFF, where there's a vote-by-vote basis or some sort of high-level agreement on certain things they can agree with the EFF or not. Because there's no other way to 50 at this point, unless something dramatically changes. So, of course, it requires them to set certain red lines in place. Obviously, you can't have a blanket agreement with the EFF regarding land, regarding expropriation without compensation, regarding nationalization of the Reserve Bank and all of the other kind of crazy stuff. But there's no other way quantitatively if you want the ANC out of government in 2024 based on current projections to have some sort of rational cooperation agreement. Other than going into the ANC coalition yourself or allowing the ANC to form a coalition with the EFF.
Yeah,
Dawie, I may add,
sure.
This whole discussion is as painful as it is because it's difficult for the DA to grow into the ANC electorate. This whole discussion could have been a much better discussion if the right strategic choices were taken 5 years ago or 4 years ago.
And why do you think those strategic choices were? What were the correct choices that they had to make?
I don't know. I wasn't involved in the DA at the time. I just, my sense is that the party didn't handle the Ramaphosa period very well. And that, yes, indeed, Musi's leadership was obviously not a success and frankly disastrous based on the election outcomes. But I think that the strategic objectives of the time were not the wrong objectives. The plan to get there was not executed well, was not resourced well, and maybe also tactically wasn't fully the right plan. But the strategic objectives were not the wrong strategic objectives to diversify the party, to grow the party, to become a big party. And in the kind of failure to deliver those strategic objectives, the baby's been thrown out of the bathwater, in that the strategic objectives have gone, and now the party's trying to be a 20% party, notwithstanding interesting polls on the front page of the report.
Do you think they made a strategic mistake in sort of framing their entire argument anti-Zuma? And the moment Zuma was gone, they were, oh, crap, what do we do now?
Not quite. I think if you go way back when to like 2007, 8, 9, they deserve a lot of credit for being early on the Zuma story. I think it was exactly the right thing to do. I think they were maligned a lot at the time. Remember, I joined the DA in 2010, so I fully aligned with the party's perspective at that point in time. Jacob Zuma clearly was disastrous. I just think that the interpretation of the kind of 2019 election result over-indexed on, from a DA perspective, on the failures of the leadership at the time, right? But also the failures of that plan, and didn't, I think, fully take into account the fact that the party didn't manage Cyril Ramaphosa very well, which, of course, is also failures of the time. But, Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC got away with absolute murder in the run-up to the 2019 election campaign in framing this like good ANC, bad ANC thing, this sort of the Zuma ANCs over there, we're here to come clean up. They just allowed that to kind of take hold much too effectively, if you ask me.
Dawie, a person like Salim Weng, who has done some numerous interviews on WorldView, he has called, I think, and a lot of people have called for this idea. I think even you have called for this idea on your Twitter feed, a sort of an umbrella organization to take on the ANC in 2024. Not necessarily a political party, but sort of a unified, a UDF 2.0 that's going to take on the ANC, which every party can align behind. And I think Musi Maimane has mentioned in a recent interview on WorldView, a lot of people get sort of messed up on the policies. Okay, there's no way you can get every party to agree on the policies. But his point is just get 2 or 3 policies. For example, his point was you don't need to get to anti-vaxxers and the vaxxers to agree on something. Forget about that. Get 3 issues which every person in South Africa can unite behind, and make that your core principle in this new UDF 2.0. What do you think of that sort of idea, a unified organization to take on the ANC in 2024?
I have a couple of thoughts. So the one thought I have is that I don't like that idea that much. And what I would very much rather prefer is a large party. A large party that actually offers a real alternative. South Africans get annoyed with all of these little parties running around. Of course, I've made the point that I think coalition parties holding each other to account is a good thing. I think it is. But I think a lot of people see complexity in it that they find annoying. They're used to government being sort of systematic and structured in one party. And so this idea of an umbrella seems quite complicated, I think, for many people. The other thing is I'm also just very worried about such an umbrella's ability to govern if it ever were to get close to it. I mean, it would be really kind of, I think, complex and problematic, right? So I'm not convinced by the idea of an umbrella of let's all contest the political or the election on our own, but we're actually all kind of one party. No, I think it should be one party and say to South Africans, this is going to be a real big thing. And to create a bit of a change moment and excitement in South Africa to really change the political landscape, I think is what's required. So no, I very much prefer the idea of a big party where you've actually gone and sat down and decided on the policies and decided on the values and decided on the plan. But I recognize that would be extraordinarily difficult. So in the absence of that, I frankly actually quite like the idea of not necessarily an umbrella, but a pledge before the next election. A pledge for each political party to pledge not to work with the ANC. So that voters can be very clear and totally concrete in their choice. Is the choice going to be potentially used to prop up the ANC or not? That's my personal perspective. I realize it puts the DA in a difficult position because I can see why they maybe want to have the back door open to a potential ANC coalition. But I honestly think that South Africa would be better served in a kind of situation where all of the opposition parties are kind of working together in a kind of non-ANC coalition. Frankly, even if the EFF is involved under certain agreed to circumstances where the red lines are very clearly stated and managed, in my view.
Dawie, a lot of people here, especially here in the Western Cape, they're terrified of an ANC-EFF coalition. So, for example, if you have that scenario in 2024 where the DA can potentially save us from an ANC-EFF coalition by going into a coalition with the ANC, how do you never mind the logistics or whether it will actually be beneficial to South Africa? How do you explain that to your voter by saying, okay, we had that chance to save you from Julius Malema becoming the deputy president and Lloyd Shivambo becoming the minister of finance? We had that opportunity to save you from that, and we decided, screw that, we're not going to do that.
Yeah, look, I mean, that's a very valid argument, right? Like, I get it. And frankly, personally, I would agree with that, frankly. But I do think, though, at the very least, all of the opposition parties should try to endeavor to form something which doesn't have the ANC in it. That's I think, for me, the most important thing. How you position it or do it or try to arrange it, I think I'm happy to take different views. And I hear you. Maybe a pledge is a bit aggressive because in the worst case scenario, you'd want it to be a ANC coalition instead of an ANC-EFF coalition. But I do still think that the best case scenario for South Africa in 2024 is a government in which the ANC is not involved, if it is at all possible. And frankly, I think it's unlikely, right, given where the numbers are. But I think it's just worth a try, and it's what the political parties should be driving towards, in my view.
So perhaps what you're saying is perhaps you should just not make it public, your intention of working with the ANC. I mean, you can keep it private, but why is it necessary to say it publicly before the 2024 election, like Helen Zille has done? We are open to this idea. You don't have to say it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
exactly. It clearly causes political problems as well when she does do it.
Yeah. I think, perhaps, I don't know. Once again, it might be a strategic choice that we don't know. Someone whispered to her, it's either that or the EFF, and you have to assure the voters you'd rather go with the ANC than the EFF. Perhaps that's the advice she got somewhere. And she...
I think that, the problem with that is, I agree, the outcomes are either an ANC-EFF coalition. Don't forget about the ANC minority government situation, which is very possible because I don't think the ANC wants to go with the EFF. Yes, indeed, an ANC-DA coalition. But it's just, for me, vitally important that the opposition parties, and particularly the DA, considers the possibility of a government without the ANC, right? I think that is possible. I agree it's unlikely, but I think it is possible. And yes, it does require a discussion about how you manage the red lines with the EFF. But if you fundamentally throw out that option, then it basically means you are de facto going to have an ANC government of some kind. And yeah, it would be just fascinating to me to see the right wing of the DA going into a coalition with the ANC. It's just going to be the most, frankly, amusing thing to observe, and really, really, really dangerous electorally for the DA down the line. What the 2026 and 2029 election looks like for the DA in a situation where they're going into coalition with the ANC in 2024. Who knows?
Betrayal.
But betrayal.
And what is to come? I mean, just look at the Liberal Democrats, what happened to them in the UK when they went to do a coalition with the Conservative Party. They were destroyed in the next election.
And how much better are the societal outcomes going to be in that situation? I agree, it's better than the counterfactual, which is the ANC-EFF coalition, for sure, but the voter would have never experienced the counterfactual, right? Yeah, I would foresee just major, major challenges for the DA in that scenario. So for the DA's own longevity and health, the scenario of a government that doesn't involve the ANC is just dramatically better for everyone involved, in my view.
Yeah, no, interesting times await. What do you think of Zungiso, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Zungiso Zibi, his new, the idea of him creating a new party? There's now, what do you call it, the spokesperson of the Democratic Alliance has also left. He's also entertaining the idea of a formation of a new party. What do you think of all? Well, I mean, 2 years is a lot of time. I mean, in political, it's ages and political lifespan. I mean, a lot of things can change.
In political formation language, it's not. So, and that's going to be tied to my answer. So, look, I think, so I read an article in the Daily Maverick, which I'm not sure how accurate it is or not, but the article claimed that Zungiso Zibi is going to pull on board Makashule Ghana. I think that we know, based on Makashule Ghana's own interviews and his exit statement said something about Zungiso Zibi, so I think he's going in that direction. It also mentioned Mbali and Tuli. It also mentioned Mcebisi Jonas, who's the former ANC Deputy Minister of Finance, and a couple of other people who are quite serious. So there's and it mentioned Dawie Scholtz, which is quite a serious constellation of people, right? So just from that constellation of people, that's quite a serious prospect. I also read Zungiso Zibi's book. I was very impressed by it. I think to an extent, but it was like quite interesting, quite compelling, quite, I think, ideologically centrist, and I think kind of would be electorally sensible from my perspective. I'm quite impressed by him personally. I think he's quite a smart guy. I see a couple of concerns though. Number one, the time is short, and name recognition, structure formation, all of the stuff is really, really difficult. Will take time. So actually, time is very short, and then it's going to move on. Secondly, I am impressed by him intellectually. I mean, the discussion until now has been him as leader of the party, so I'm just assuming it would be. I wonder if he has the right charismatic elements to do it. I think we have to see, right? Let's not judge him before he hasn't given a speech, but like, I think we have to see. And then finally, is just also the kind of already forming perception that they're quite like urban, quite like elite, again, fishing in the same pool as the DA, some minorities, urban areas, not so much out in the sticks, not so much with poor people.
You have to go into the townships. The voters are in the townships. Exactly. You have to get them somehow.
So the question is, will they find a way to get to the townships in mass on time? I'm doubtful, to be perfectly honest. But at this point, everything can help towards 2024. So I'm hopeful, to be perfectly honest, because I think it's another arrow in the quiver at this point towards flipping ANC voters to the opposition side, and on a generally sensible market platform, right? I think Sogezo is definitely left of the DA, and even a little left of Action SA. But still, I think broadly market sensible. Is my assessment of where he is ideologically based on reading his book.
You spoke of charisma. What do you think of the former Chief Justice? Now, apparently you're running... nobody really knows what's going on there. I mean, all we have is this 240p video where he apparently announced his candidacy for the... what do you think of that?
I also don't know anything about it, right? Other than the 240p video. So who knows? But what's kind of implied by the gossip, right? The parties involved and the people involved is that's serious business. That is electorally serious business out there in South Africa. So let's see. I don't think there's too much to go on at this point. We have to see. But that's potentially consequential. But probably consequential, but not helpful, right? I don't see wherever they land being helpful to a potential kind of non-ANC government of opposition parties. However, they are helpful in that they drag the ANC number down even more, potentially. And kind of now the ANC also has to set up a coalition that is quite a few parties if that thing really gets legs and starts going.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is this, if I understand it correctly, this proposal that under this new party, they will nationalize all land. And that the former Chief Justice, Mogoeng, would be in favor of this. This is, that's very peculiar.
Look, I think we should also be just like reserve judgment a little bit. Like, I'm not a defender of Mogoeng in any way, but like, we also only have a 240p video, so let's not judge his positions just yet.
Yeah, well, Dawie, thank you so much. I see we're running out of time. Is there any message that you want to leave our viewers before I conclude? Thank you so much for once again appearing on this podcast company and for your wise analysis. Is there anything you want to leave our viewers with before we conclude?
No, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dawie. To our viewers, you most certainly enjoy this content, so please like this video, share it as widely as possible to spread Dawie's message, and subscribe to our channel. My name is Donald. You've been watching WorldView.